The frantic screams of a terrified teenager echoed through the empty house, just days after she had saved her mother from a violent ex. Now, the home that had once been a refuge of hope and recovery stood silent, holding a chilling secret. The house was eerily quiet as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the living room. Dust motes danced in the golden rays that pierced through the slightly grimy window, illuminating the worn floral pattern of the sofa. The smell of stale air and old furniture hung heavy in the room, a musty odor that spoke of neglect and underlying sorrow. Outside, a robin chirped merrily from a branch of the ancient oak tree that dominated the small, overgrown front yard. The world continued as usual, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding within those four walls. But inside, a storm of grief and confusion brewed, threatening to drown the fragile spirit of the young girl who had just discovered the unimaginable. 16-year-old Emily had always been the protector, the anchor in a turbulent sea. Her life hadn't been easy. Her father had left when she was barely 5, leaving her mother, Caroline, struggling to make ends meet. Caroline, a sweet woman with a gentle soul, had always been vulnerable, a quality that unfortunately attracted the wrong kind of attention. Caroline met Mark when Emily was 10. He was charming, initially attentive, and seemed to offer the stability and affection they both desperately craved. But the charm was a facade, a mask that slowly crumbled to reveal a controlling and increasingly volatile man. What started as subtle criticisms escalated into verbal abuse, then threats, and finally, physical violence. Caroline, trapped by a mixture of fear, dependence, and a desperate hope that she could somehow fix him, remained in the relationship far longer than she should have. Emily had lived in constant anxiety, her young life overshadowed by the looming presence of Mark. She witnessed the slow erosion of her mother's spirit, the gradual dimming of her bright eyes. She saw the bruises, heard the whispered apologies, and felt the suffocating weight of secrecy that blanketed their home. She knew that each day could be the day Mark's anger would explode, the day her mother would be seriously hurt, or worse. She lived in a perpetual state of hypervigilance, her senses always attuned to the slightest change in atmosphere, the slightest hint of danger. Despite the constant fear, Emily never lost her fierce protectiveness towards her mother. She became Caroline's confidant, her shield, and her reason to keep going. She learned to deflect Mark's anger, to soothe Caroline's pain, and to navigate the treacherous minefield of their dysfunctional family dynamic. She dreamed of a future where they would both be free, where they could escape the clutches of Mark and build a new life, a life filled with peace and happiness. Caroline had finally managed to break free from Mark a few months ago, spurred on by one particularly brutal attack that left her with a fractured rib and a bruised face. Emily had been the one who finally convinced her to go to the police, to file a restraining order, and to seek help from a local women's shelter. It was a difficult decision, fraught with fear and uncertainty, but Caroline knew that for Emily's sake, she had to leave. The restraining order provided a small measure of comfort, but Emily remained on edge. She knew Mark was unpredictable, capable of anything. He had violated the restraining order several times, driving past their house, sending threatening text messages, and even calling Caroline late at night, his voice slurred and menacing. Each violation was reported to the police, but the wheels of justice turned slowly, offering little immediate protection. But a week ago, Emily had done the unthinkable. Mark had shown up uninvited, drunk and violent, banging on their front door and demanding to see Caroline. Caroline, terrified, had frozen, unable to move. Emily, fueled by a surge of adrenaline and years of pent-up fear and rage, stepped in, risking her own life to protect her mother. She stood her ground, her small frame trembling, but her voice firm. She told Mark to leave, to never come back. He laughed, his eyes bloodshot, and his breath reeking of alcohol. He grabbed Caroline by the arm, pulling her towards him. Emily didn't hesitate. She kicked him in the shin, hard, and then grabbed a nearby baseball bat that they kept by the door for protection. She swung the bat, connecting with Mark's arm. He howled in pain, releasing Caroline. Emily stood between them, brandishing the bat like a weapon. "Get out!" she screamed, her voice raw with fear and determination. "Get out and never come back!" Mark, momentarily stunned by the force of her resistance, backed down. He mumbled threats, his eyes filled with hatred, and then stumbled away, disappearing into the night. Emily called the police, her hands shaking as she relayed the events of the evening. Mark was arrested later that night and charged with violating the restraining order and assault. It had been a terrifying moment, a blur of panic and adrenaline, but Emily had saved her mother, or so she thought. In the aftermath, Caroline was shaken but grateful, overwhelmed by Emily's bravery. They hugged, tears streaming down their faces, vowing to start anew, to build a better future, free from the shadow of Mark. The following days were filled with a fragile sense of hope. Caroline seemed lighter, more relaxed. She started going for walks in the park, spending time with friends, and even talking about going back to school to finish her degree. Emily allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had finally turned a corner. The day Emily came home after a long day at school, everything seemed disconcertingly normal. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the worn furniture. The air was still and quiet, almost unnaturally so. She called out for her mother, expecting to hear the comforting hum of a TV or the enticing smell of dinner cooking. "Mom, I'm home!" But there was no response, only silence. A knot of unease tightened in Emily's stomach. Caroline was usually home by this time, preparing dinner or working on her laptop. She never left without telling Emily where she was going. A prickle of fear ran down her spine, a chilling premonition of impending doom. She walked through the house, her heart beginning to race, her footsteps echoing in the unnerving silence. She checked the living room, the kitchen, the bathroom. Each room was empty, devoid of any sign of Caroline. Her anxiety intensified with each passing moment, morphing into a full-blown panic. She reached her mother's bedroom, the door slightly ajar. She hesitated for a moment, a sense of dread washing over her. She pushed the door open, bracing herself for the unknown. What she saw next would haunt her forever. Caroline lay motionless on the floor, sprawled on her side near the bed. Her eyes were closed, her face pale and still. A faint trace of blood stained the carpet near her head, a small dark pool that seemed to mock the fragile peace of the room. Emily rushed to her mother, her mind reeling, her body numb with shock. "Mom! Mom! Wake up!" She shook her gently, desperately hoping for some sign of life. She called out her name, her voice cracking with desperation, but it was too late. Her mother, the woman she had just saved, the woman she loved more than anything in the world, was gone. A guttural scream ripped from Emily's throat, tearing through the silence of the house. She collapsed beside her mother, sobbing uncontrollably, her body racked with grief and despair. The world around her blurred, the room spinning, the reality of the situation crashing down on her with brutal force. Her mother was dead, and she was alone. The scene that followed was a chaotic blur. The paramedics arrived, their faces grim as they confirmed the inevitable. The police swarmed the house, their voices professional but detached, as they cordoned off the scene and began their investigation. Emily sat in a corner, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes fixed on the lifeless form of her mother. She answered the officers' questions in a daze, her voice barely a whisper. She couldn't comprehend what had happened, how her mother could be gone, just like that. The loss was unbearable, a gaping hole in her heart that threatened to consume her entirely, and the guilt she felt was suffocating, a heavy weight that pressed down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. Why hadn't she been there when her mother needed her most? Had Mark somehow found a way to get to her, despite the restraining order and the police protection? Was it the trauma from the earlier attack that had caused Caroline's death? Or was there something more sinister at play? The police investigation was inconclusive. The initial assessment pointed towards a possible fall, perhaps caused by a medical episode. There were no signs of forced entry, no obvious signs of foul play. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the official explanation didn't add up. She knew her mother, knew her habits, knew her health, and she knew that Caroline wouldn't have simply fallen and died without a struggle, without calling for help. Emily couldn't answer these questions, but she knew one thing. The truth behind her mother's death was still out there, hidden in the shadows, and she would stop at nothing to uncover it. She owed it to her mother, to the woman who had sacrificed so much for her, to find out what really happened on that fateful day. The days that followed were a torturous blend of grief, confusion, and a gnawing sense of injustice. Emily moved in with her aunt, Sarah, a kind but reserved woman who struggled to express her emotions. Sarah did her best to provide comfort and support, but Emily felt isolated and alone, trapped in a bubble of sorrow. The funeral was a blur of faces and condolences, a somber gathering of friends and family who mourned the loss of Caroline's gentle spirit. Emily stood by her mother's coffin, numb with grief, vowing to keep her memory alive. As the investigation stalled, Emily became increasingly frustrated. The police seemed to be losing interest in the case, content with their initial assessment of an accidental death. But Emily refused to let it go. She spent hours poring over police reports, questioning detectives, and even conducting her own amateur investigation. She revisited the house, the scene of her mother's death, searching for clues that the police might have missed. She meticulously examined the room, looking for anything out of place, anything that could shed light on what had happened. She interviewed neighbors, asking if they had seen or heard anything unusual on the day of Caroline's death. Most of them had nothing to report, but one elderly woman mentioned seeing a suspicious car parked down the street earlier that afternoon. She couldn't describe the car in detail, but she remembered it being dark-colored and unfamiliar. Emily also focused her attention on Mark, Caroline's abusive ex-boyfriend. Despite the restraining order, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow involved in her mother's death. She knew he was capable of anything, that his rage and obsession knew no bounds. She discovered that Mark had been released from jail just days before Caroline's death, after serving a short sentence for violating the restraining order. He was still legally prohibited from contacting Caroline, but Emily knew that wouldn't stop him. She hired a private investigator, a grizzled ex-cop named Frank, to dig deeper into Mark's activities. Frank was skeptical at first, dismissing her concerns as the product of grief and paranoia. But Emily's unwavering determination and her compelling story eventually convinced him to take on the case. Frank began by tracking Mark's movements, monitoring his phone calls, and interviewing his acquaintances. He quickly discovered that Mark had been making threatening phone calls to Caroline in the weeks leading up to her death, using burner phones and disguising his voice. He had also been seen lurking around their neighborhood, watching their house from a distance. Frank also uncovered evidence that Mark had been planning to leave town, withdrawing a large sum of money from his bank account and purchasing a one-way ticket to Mexico. This strongly suggested that he was trying to evade the police, further fueling Emily's suspicion that he was responsible for Caroline's death. Armed with this new information, Emily confronted the police, demanding that they reopen the investigation and focus their attention on Mark. The police, initially reluctant, were eventually swayed by the overwhelming evidence. They issued a warrant for Mark's arrest and launched a full-scale manhunt. Days turned into weeks, and the search for Mark intensified. Emily waited anxiously for news, her hope flickering between despair and a burning desire for justice. She couldn't rest until she knew that Mark was behind bars, that he would never be able to hurt anyone again. Finally, after weeks of relentless pursuit, Mark was apprehended by the police in a small town near the Mexican border. He was taken into custody and charged with Caroline's murder. The trial was a grueling and emotionally draining experience for Emily. She had to relive the horrors of her past, recounting the abuse she and her mother had endured at the hands of Mark. She had to face him in court, her eyes filled with anger and grief, as he denied any involvement in Caroline's death. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including the threatening phone calls, the eyewitness accounts, and the financial records. They argued that Mark had been driven by jealousy and rage, that he had stalked and harassed Caroline relentlessly, and that he had ultimately murdered her in a fit of anger. The defense argued that Mark was innocent, that Caroline's death was an accident, and that Emily was simply trying to frame him out of spite. They attempted to discredit Emily's testimony, painting her as an unstable and unreliable witness. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury was ultimately convinced of Mark's guilt. After days of deliberation, they returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Mark was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Emily sat in the courtroom, tears streaming down her face as the verdict was read. A wave of relief washed over her, a sense of closure that she had long thought impossible. She had finally achieved justice for her mother, the woman who had loved her unconditionally and who had sacrificed so much for her. The journey had been long and arduous, filled with pain and sorrow. But Emily had emerged from the darkness stronger and more resilient than ever before. She had faced her fears, confronted her demons, and fought for the truth. She had honored her mother's memory and ensured that her abuser would finally pay for his crimes. In the years that followed, Emily dedicated her life to helping other victims of domestic violence. She became an advocate for women's rights, volunteering at local shelters and speaking out against abuse. She shared her story with others, offering hope and inspiration to those who were trapped in similar situations. She never forgot her mother, the woman who had taught her the importance of love, compassion, and resilience. She kept her memory alive by sharing stories about her, by celebrating her life, and by continuing to fight for justice. Emily's story is a testament to the power of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable tragedy, hope can still prevail. It is a call to action, urging us to stand up against domestic violence, to support victims, and to create a world where everyone is safe from abuse.